There was a whole campaign to get poor Trita deported, like as if he was some Salvadoran gun runner.
I know that there's been all kinds of attempts to, bug my phone and all of these different things. And I feel bad for these people. I'm not that interesting. They're going to be bored out of their minds listening to my conversations and getting into my emails, etc. In my case, they've not been as effective as they wanted, particularly given the amount of resources that they put into it.
Have you ever consulted with this White House or people close to this White House and the State Department, right now, Mark Rubio's State Department? It really looks like the talks in Switzerland are proceeding well. It looks like there's some progress being made. You've had J.D. Vance acknowledging that there's progress made. You've had these waivers on the sales of Iranian oils issued by the Treasury Department. You have all sorts of praise coming from Qatar and Pakistan about the progress of the talks. The Iranians have also noted progress in those talks. The only huge issue that remains is Lebanon, and this is going to really be a problem this whole time because I don't think that the Israelis are going to let up on their offensive in Lebanon, and I don't think that the Iranians are going to allow the continued war against Hezbollah in Lebanon without some kind of response. This could really derail the deal. I'm Borzu Dergahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands, and you can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. You can also find me at Apple Podcasts. You can find me on Spotify. You can find me on YouTube. By the time you get this, it'll be Tuesday, June 23rd. So today I have a really good show, and later on I have an interview with Trita Parsi. It's a very good interview, and it's a really interesting moment to interview him. I'd actually planned to interview him a while ago because I started seeing him on a bunch of right-leaning news outlets, and I thought it was really interesting. He's been appearing on like Steve Bannon. They were not your typical places where someone like Trita Parsi would appear as an analyst. Trita is an interesting guy. He's a Swedish-Iranian scholar, and he wrote a book a long time ago that I really enjoyed. I liked his book. It was called Treacherous Alliances, and we talk about that in the interview that is coming up. But he's also been really weirdly, bizarrely vilified as a kind of lobbyist for the Islamic Republic of Iran. I don't understand that at all. We talk about that as well in the interview because he's been very critical of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And also because of the travels that he'd made, he went and took the time to visit Israel and speak to officials in Israel. Because of that, if he goes back to Iran, he'll be immediately put in prison. And he did these travels as part of his research for his book, as well as the kind of the second track dual diplomacy that he's been involved with, the kind of conversations that he's been involved with. And for that reason, because he talks to people all over the world, he consults with governments, he talks to diplomats all over the world, I think he's really valuable. And I'm very, as an Iranian American, even though he's not actually Iranian American, he is actually Iranian Swedish, I'm really proud to have someone like that in the community. We talk about that also as well, why it is that so many people in the Iranian American community kind of ignorantly vilify him just because he advocates what many people in the U.S. advocate and what a majority of the U.S. public wants, which is a diplomatic resolution to the problems that the U.S. has with Iran, despite the extreme human rights abuses and so on in Iran. Trita was very much in the news lately because of a report that appeared in the Free Press. That's a news outlet that is run by Barry Weiss, who's a pro-Israel tool of one of the richest people in the world, Larry Ellison, the founder and owner, basically, of Oracle, and a very big, huge supporter of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, known for his vehement support for Israel, as well as for Trump or whoever is the most pro-Israel candidate going for the White House. And this Free Press published an article saying that there was an effort inside the State Department to deport Trita, to kick him out of the United States, where he's lived for decades with his family in the Washington area. And this report elicited a very strange response. First of all, a lot of people came out, even people who disagree with Trita, even are on opposite sides of the political spectrum, they came out and condemned this apparent drive to deport Trita from the United States. And then something really interesting happened. The State Department itself came out and said there is no such effort, that the State Department is not doing anything to try to deport Trita Parsi from the United States, from his home, and that what the speculation is that the Free Press itself, this article was the attempt to get a drive to deport him from the country. Why deport him from the country? Because he's an advocate of diplomacy and a diplomatic resolution as opposed to war. And he's long been that. So he's been a lightning rod for a while. I've known him and we've never had a really extensive conversation. I've quoted him in my articles, listened to his podcasts and interviews a million times. I just, I can't believe that someone like this has been subject to this kind of treatment. And we get into that during the interview as well. First, though, just to briefly talk about the news, there has been some progress, as I noted, and there has been some hopeful signs coming out of both the White House and Tehran. This is probably good news for those of us who advocate diplomacy and those of us who don't want a return to war. But the hawks are also on the roll, and there's reports of like Lindsay Graham outlining this plan where if the diplomatic efforts fail, the U.S. will immediately try to seize the Strait of Hormuz. And it's like, honey, you don't think that the Americans would have done that if they could have? You don't think that Donald Trump didn't go to his generals and say, hey, give me a plan to take the Strait of Hormuz? And then say, Mr. President, we looked at all of these. Here are the PowerPoint presentations. Here's this scenario. Here's this landing and so on. And each one of them was either prohibitively expensive, it had no guarantee of success, or would cause so many casualties as to be essentially impossible to sell to an American public that 78% want an end to the war like yesterday. In any case, I spoke a little bit about the complicated political dynamics involving the diplomacy, as well as the ongoing developments over the last couple days or so, especially on Monday, where you've had these very positive reports of diplomatic breakthroughs. I spoke about these developments in an interview with India's NewsX World. Here, take a listen.
While the negotiations were happening, President Trump tweeted warning. Do you think that was particularly towards just the negotiators because he wanted a breakthrough, or do you think there's a disalignment within Trump's own party or negotiator team?
Well, I think it has to be said that he's not really well, and he does this kind of stuff all the time. It's obvious to anyone that he's kind of mentally incapacitated. He's undermining his own negotiators at a crucial moment. Probably someone got him on the phone and got him riled up and caused him to lash out. He was later got someone else on the phone, caused him to calm down. This is not a person who's stable. As a matter of fact, according to several reports that I've read, the Iranian negotiating team has brought on psychologists to assess the state of Donald Trump's illness, his obvious mental illness, and tailored its messaging to make sure that his mental instability is taken into account. And one of the things that they have noted reportedly is that they've seen progress with this approach and noticed better results.
What do you think, or how do you analyze the capacity and capability of the negotiator from U.S. side versus the Iran side?
I think there is a possibility. I think J.D. Vance is not an idiot. He seems to be serious. There was an amazing photograph of him and the Qatari negotiator sitting down and actually working together, writing up notes. It showed intense concentration. He has energy. I mean, ideologically, yes, the U.S. and Iran are not in a alignment. But I don't know if J.D. Vance has any ideology except himself. I mean, he's a total careerist who has reinvented himself many times. And here is another reinvention as a global peacemaker. It's very opportunistic for him. It's also a good moment for him to reinvent himself, define himself away from the Trump administration. As for the Iranians, they've been through this before. Many of the people on the Iranian negotiating team were junior or mid-level diplomats at the time of the JCPOA negotiations. Those went on from 2013, including Abbas Araghchi, including the foreign ministry spokesman, Baqai. These names popped up way back then, too. So they know how to deal with this. They know the technical issues involved. And I think it's a good sign of the progress that's been made, regardless of who's involved in the talks, that they're already talking about a roadmap toward restoring order. And they seem to be, at least to some extent, serious about restoring some semblance of peace in Lebanon.
How Iran is positioned politically in Middle East and the image of Iran, has that changed before February and versus after February?
Well, I think that among a lot of people in the global South, they're being hailed as, heroes for standing up to Israel and the United States. I mean, I don't think this is very deep. It's not like a profound ideological realignment. People like to see the Americans get their comeuppance, and people really like to see Israel get its comeuppance globally. So I don't think this is any kind of huge dramatic shift. It has improved Iran's opinion. I don't think the World Cup and kind of ambitious, plucky performance in the World Cup hurts either. But mind you, this is very shallow and this is very superficial. If it is seen that Iran is dragging these negotiations out and causing damage to the world economy by needlessly keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed and by increasing tensions, dragging on the war in Lebanon, contributing to the chaos in other parts of the world, that public opinion could very easily shift.
Has this war exposed the limitation of U.S. and Israel alignment? And where do you think their relationship is before February versus now?
I joke that Donald Trump was, before he was beholden to the oligarchs who financed his campaign, now he's beholden to the oligarchs who are his golf buddies in the oil industry and the weapons industry and so on. They're saying this war is bad for business, and he's listening to them because he's not going to run for office again. So, I mean, Donald Trump and the White House and Washington are corrupt at a level that has never been seen in the U.S. before, and he just follows the money, wherever that money may be. And right now, there's no money in continuing this war. His golf buddies are telling him that the continued disruptions are causing demand destruction in the consumer markets, causing people to change habits. This war is bad for business, so he's winding it down. Meanwhile, Israel has an ideological interest in continuing this conflict. They want to see the job done, the job finished. And what that means is destruction of smashing the Iranian state into various statelets, making it a more manageable problem for Israel for its ambitions, which likely include geographic expansion in the Middle East area, and they don't want Iran to stop it. So there's definitely a disalignment between the U.S. and Israel.
Who can or cannot afford for these talks to fall out? Can Israel even continue their war against their neighbors without U.S. support? And can U.S. and Iran afford for these talks to fall off?
I don't think the U.S. can afford it. I don't think in the long run Iran can afford it. Israel wants the talks to fail. Israel has made it very clear that it wants the talks to fail. Can Israel continue a low-level, something like a counterinsurgency campaign in southern Lebanon without U.S. support? Yes, it can, but it can't expand beyond that. Lebanon is a complex country, and eventually I think that if it gets too ambitious, the entire Lebanese population may sign on to the Hezbollah project, as allergic as many Lebanese factions were to the Hezbollah project in the first place. So the longer this goes on, I think that'll hurt the Israeli cause. But yes, they can continue the war, just at not a very effective level without tremendous U.S. support. And eventually, there is this danger that Iran will get its ballistic missiles back together. It'll get its defenses back together and respond to the Israeli incursions in Lebanon by hitting Israel proper. And as we've seen before, that could really hurt. And without American support, without Jordanian backing, without French anti-missile launchers that are positioned around the region, without the help of the Western powers, I think Israel will be much more vulnerable.
You know, we heard some reports coming in that, you know, even if the sanctions are removed, it's not the people of Iran, local ordinary citizens of Iran, who are going to benefit from it. It's the IRGC who have a lot of stakes in these businesses and stuff. What is the reality, if you can share with us?
Well, I can say that based on the historical track record, that is not accurate. In the past, when sanctions have been eased, it has benefited a large portion of the country and not just the IRGC. For example, after 2013, when the moderate president, pragmatist Hassan Rouhani came into power and the U.S. eased sanctions a little bit under Obama, there was this flurry of entrepreneurial economic startups. The whole tech sector got launched there. The country thrived a little bit. Its consumer market expanded. Its luxury goods market expanded. And this helped people across the board. There was more jobs. There was the service industry expanding. And then when the sanctions were tightened again under maximum pressure of Donald Trump, then the economy basically contracted, and that hurt everyone, perhaps except the IRGC.
Now, looking at US's domestic politics with a lot of criticism is how much domestic political pressure could affect Trump's decision-making and the negotiations.
Well, there was a poll that was published yesterday by CBS News and YouGov that said that 78% of Americans want the war to end now. So I think actually this could help the Republicans. It could help Donald Trump. The problem is that many Republicans and Donald Trump answer not just to voters, but to the very powerful Israel lobby and to a lesser extent the weapons lobby in Washington. And so they're under pressure from both their voters and their donors. And that's the problem with the United States right now. As I said before, it's the corruption, and the level of corruption has gotten out of control. And so here it is, my interview with Trita Parsi. Part of it will be paywalled. If you could subscribe, that would be great. But it might very well be that in a couple weeks or so, I'll put the whole interview up for free on YouTube or somewhere else. So if you don't want to pay and you don't want to sign up for a free trial or whatnot, you can probably find the interview in like 10 days or so, somewhere on either Spotify or YouTube or somewhere else. So throughout this whole conflict with Iran, and I'm talking starting like 10 or 11 years ago, there was a certain group of people, and I wouldn't totally count myself among them, but a certain group of analysts who were basically saying from the very beginning that, look, the alternative to diplomacy is war. And they were saying that very stridently. And, many people doubted them. They said, no, the JCPOA, the nuclear deal is not the way, that you're basically fear-mongering by saying that if you don't sign the deal, there's going to be war. And, in fact, it was accurate. It was the correct prognosis that the ripping up of the nuclear deal, not going into the nuclear deal, would have led to war, because that's what it did. And you know who sensed that very well? I think the Barack Obama administration, they realized this as well. And another person who was really good and really smart on all of this, and one of the reasons why certain analysts get on TV a lot and get quoted a lot, is because they've been right. And they've been right repeatedly, and they have a really good track record. And one of those people is a rather, unfortunately, in my opinion, controversial person named Trita Parsi. He is not even an Iranian American. He is maybe just culturally Iranian American, but he's actually a Swedish Iranian living in the U.S. for many years. He is the co-founder of the National Iranian American Council, which is a kind of lobby for Iranian American community in the United States. And he is currently the co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute. It's a kind of realist, centrist, maybe left-leaning kind of think tank on foreign policy. And he is joining me today, Trita. And I guess you didn't get deported. You're not in another country right now, because there was a whole campaign to get poor Trita deported, like as if he was some Salvadoran gun runner or something like that. Trita, you're still in the United States. You haven't been deported yet. Am I correct?
Not at all. Not at all. Look, as you mentioned or you alluded to, there's been efforts for quite some time to make me a controversial person and to silence me, cancel me, deplatform me, etc. It's only as of late, when these elements, and they're mainly the neocons and very pro-Israeli elements, that have gone so desperate that they've actually started a campaign to try to get me deported. It appears to have backfired. I'm certainly still here. The State Department even came out and denied it because it was just so insane. I'm sure they're going to continue to try. They're relentless. They've been relentlessly pushing for this war. Even when the JCPOA was struck, we all thought that, okay, well, at least now that chapter is over. Not at all. They kept on pushing, and eventually they succeeded in pushing Trump to walk out of the deal, which is part of the reason why we're dealing with this disaster right now. But Benjamin Netanyahu is on record of claiming and bragging that he's the one who got Trump to walk out of the JCPOA. So that group, that sentiment, that line of thinking has been after me for a very long time. It really started with my first book that revealed what was going on in the U.S., Israeli, Iranian triangle. And they've just escalated throughout. But as I think you pointed out correctly, they've been proven so wrong on all of their policy recommendations and directions, and the entire world is paying a price for it, right?
Trita, and I mean this with all due respect, why deport you? I mean, like, and I'm not insulting you or anything, but you're kind of like a boring, bookish guy. And I'm going to refer, like, why would you want to deport this guy? I saw you on Wolf Blitzer once, and he was like, you're like my own son, like he was obviously very proud of you because you guys both went to Johns Hopkins or something like that. And he was obviously like, you're such a good boy. I wish Mike, like it. And, on your book, I read your book a long time ago. And I got to say, I'm not like, like, I don't want to, compliment or flatter you or anything like that. But it was a really good book. Wow. And, like how you read like a book, let's say, I don't know, like Yitzhak Nakash's Shia of Iraq. And you read the book and you're like, wow, this actually advances not just my kind of informative knowledge of what happened, and because it was so well researched and went into corners that no one else had gone to at that point, but it also, I think it like advanced my theoretical framework, like your whole kind of theory about how no country wants to have worse relations with Iran than the United States does. So the different countries of the region, sort of adjust their policies. That was like a really smart, political science. But anyway, I'm just saying, it's like, why get you deported? There seems like a lot more kind of interesting people that they could go after, and a lot more combative people. You're so polite and nice, and I don't understand it. What threat do you pose?
Right. So before I answer your question, and by the way, thank you so much for your kind words. I do really appreciate it. For all of the viewers who are now thinking, hey, I got to buy this book. The book is called Treacherous Alliance. That's the one that you're referring to without mentioning the name. Look, I agree with you. I think I'm kind of boring. I know that there's been all kinds of attempts to, bug my phone and all of these different things. And I feel bad for these people. I'm not that interesting. They're going to be bored out of their minds listening to my conversations and getting into my emails, etc. If I were to guess, and again, I don't know for certain, but if I were to guess, if you're a very aggressive person who is undiplomatic, you will likely commit a lot of mistakes and you will cancel yourself one way or another. And as a result, whatever efforts you're doing to push back against the neocon agenda may not end up becoming as effective as it could be. But if you're boring and diplomatic, and you're trying to put forward an objective analysis as to why these policies are going to go in the wrong direction, and also reveal how some of these decisions have been made, and particularly what the Israeli calculations actually are rather than the rhetoric that they're putting forward, over time, I think you're going to end up becoming much more of a challenge for them, because the amount of resources, I have to tell you, that they've put in to try to silence me, and I have to say, some of it absolutely has been successful. They ran a huge campaign in 2022 during the Mahsa Amini protest to really,
which we all supported, which we were all behind, like 100%. By the way,
and they ran a massive campaign to try to make it look try to make NYAC and myself and anyone who was actually against sanctions and in favor of diplomacy completely toxic. And I have to say, that inflicted a cost on me, inflicted a cost on NYAC, I'm sure, and many others, some others who actually fared much worse. So it's not as if it's not effective. It's just in my case, they've not been as effective as they wanted, particularly given the amount of resources that they put into it. And part of the reason is that I never worked for any of these traditional think tanks. I was for a brief period of time at Carnegie. I've always tried to make sure that I have my own platform, my own funders, because I saw the environment in Washington. It was very clear. If someone else is funding you and their perception and their ideology or political leanings are very, very different, and particularly if they're very vulnerable or afraid of challenging conventional thinking, you're not going to have a successful career. You're not going to be able to do what you want to do. They're going to silence you. But that's not my case. I helped co-found NYAC. We were 82 funded by small donations from the Iranian American community. The rest was coming from pro-peace, pro-diplomacy American foundations. They couldn't cancel that voice, at least not by getting, board members, et cetera, to turn against it or funders to turn against it. Same thing with Quincy. And with Quincy, I have to say, there is something we have done that I think they are very, very worried about, which is that Quincy Institute from the outset, we wanted to change the entire paradigm of American foreign policy away from liberal hegemony and towards restraint and realism. And we knew that that could never be achieved if you only rely on one party. So from the outset, we were transpartisan. We work with the right, we work with the left. We have people in the organization that are very left-leaning. We have people in the organization that are right-leaning. But this meant that we suddenly now had access and build bridges with elements on the right. So, people have seen me on Steve Bannon. I was just on Steve Bannon's show just a couple of hours ago. I was on Tucker, and many of our team go on all kinds of shows, from Democracy Now! All the way to Steve Bannon and Tucker, etc.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that intrigued me and spurred me to reach out for an interview, as I saw you on one of these new right-wing stations, News Nation or something like that. And I thought that was really interesting that you were open to appearing on those networks as well.
And look, I've been advocating for diplomacy for the last 25 years. If I don't practice it myself, I wouldn't have any credibility. But also from a strategic standpoint, you're not going to change the grand strategy and the paradigm of American foreign policy by just talking to one side, and particularly just talking to people who already agree with you. So you have to reach out. The problem, frankly, has been the mainstream media, because the narrowness of opinions that are allowed is just, it's almost non-existent at this point. It's really to their own detriment. And on Gaza in particular, it was just completely unacceptable for me to censor myself going on TV on those shows. So I still do, but you know the news industry better than I do, having been and continuing to be a journalist. Things are changing dramatically. Far more people are now watching these alternative media shows because they frankly provide much more real journalism and allow a spectrum of opinion to be debated and included. But nevertheless, the point of going into the right-wing media was a huge threat to these neocons, because they were already dealing with that fight within the Republican Party, in which they were increasingly being pushed out. And on top of that, they had voices like mine and others from the realist and restraint movement going in there. And I think that is part of the reason why they now have escalated their cancellation operations into a failed deportation operation.
Yeah, I thought it was actually just really disgusting and condemnable what they were trying to do, and they're still at it. I saw Laura Loomer tweeted about you today. Even
she did? I didn't see that.
Yeah. So just as a matter of curiosity, like, you were a co-founder of the National Iranian American Council, and you live in the U.S. With your family. But then there's this whole toxic element of the Iranian diaspora that considers you, and me as well, by the way, although not as aggressively as they go after you. I'm not on the infographic, and I felt a little ashamed and a little bit sad. Why am I not? Why is my photo?
I'm sure.
It's something that I aspire
after this
to.
Interview. After this interview, I'm sure you will get there.
First of all, how is it for you? Like, are you rejected by fellow Iranian Americans? Are you embraced? Is there a coldness? When you walk into like a Persian restaurant in Washington, do people turn away or something like that? I'm curious how it is being you in the Iranian American community.
Even during the worst moment, which was when this, and by the way, I do think it was an Israeli-funded campaign. I have some evidence for it, to really make NIAC, myself, and other supporters of peace, diplomacy, and against sanctions toxic. Even during those moments, I would say that at least 8 out of 10 interactions I had with Iranian Americans who I don't know coming up to me, whether it is at the gym, whether it is at a restaurant or just on the street, in the metro, were always positive. It was only during that period in which I definitely saw an uptick in negative ones as well. But there haven't been that many. I would say that there's only 2 or 3 that I can really remember because the rudeness that we now see all over the place on the internet, etc. But never like that at all. And I think
you
it really
experienced any of that? Like the toxicity that we've seen during the war, for example, all these references
not for a year.
Even during the war.
Well, actually, hold on. There was one incident that I did not notice until it was put on the internet, which was that I was at the airport flying out from Munich after the Munich Security Conference. And apparently someone was filming me and cursing at me the same way that you see now all over the internet. I didn't hear it. You could see me walk there. I'm looking at the screen trying to figure out which gate I need to go to. And I'm just on my way. Had no idea about it. I land in DC after that flight. and I see a text message from a friend to an Instagram video. I don't have Instagram, so I had to click on it. And I was like, oh my God, that's the clothes I'm wearing right now. And I look a little bit further and I realized this was just happening hours ago, that they were cursing at me. But apparently they were polite enough not to curse loud enough because I couldn't hear it. Yeah. I think I may have had my earbuds on as well. So perhaps that's part of the reason I didn't hear it. So that one actually is true. It did happen. I didn't notice it at the time.
I didn't hear about it. But there is this element in the Iranian American community focused on the monarchists. They're rather toxic. They even go after Yasamin Ansari. She's the congresswoman in Arizona. And she even takes AIPAC money. And they still attack her and they go after her publicly. And shouldn't we be proud of her as a community that she's the highest elected official from the Iranian American community, and yet she's the target of vicious attacks? What is that? What is that element in the Iranian American community?
Look, in some ways it's really shocking to see their conduct and the rudeness and the way that they're cursing at people even when children are present. Or some of the worst, I have to say, is what we saw outside of the Iran-New Zealand soccer game, in which they were cursing at old women, including one old woman who was in a wheelchair. I mean, it is absolutely disgusting. But something that also came out of that I think we should not forget. I spoke to a lot of people who were in the stadium, and they said, look, outside of the stadium, there were about 100 or so people that were just horrible in the terms of how rude they were. Inside the stadium, there was a completely different atmosphere. There were some bad apples that were trying to pick fights and were behaving like that. But the vast majority of the people, even who were holding the old flag, the monarchist flag, they were there to support the team MLE, to support the Iranian team. Not at all falling for this nonsensical idea that you should treat the team of the soccer team as being an extension of the Islamic Republic. And I want to say something more about that in a second.
Sure.
But the first point I wanted to make is that there is an unfortunate, exaggerated reality on social media in which all of these terrible type of exchanges are always the ones that get elevated. They are triggered by the algorithm. So we keep on seeing those things. And they're there. You can't deny that, of course. But they're just a fraction of reality. So even at the game, they were just a fraction of reality. And I think it's a reminder for us to recognize that we should not judge the entire community by those, in my view, despicable people who were dancing and singing when the bombs were falling. They are there. Unfortunately, we have to analyze how come the situation has gotten so bad that you have that type of a expression. But they are no way, shape, or form a majority, or not even necessarily a large minority, despite the fact that they're extremely, extremely loud. And there were a lot of pictures of people with the two different flags, hugging each other, etc., because they were all there supporting the team. But if you just look at social media, you think that there are two camps and the two flags represent those camps in a very, there's no overlap or anything like that, and that they're in constant warfare with each other. And that's just simply not the case.
To shift gears a little bit, something that I've always wanted to ask you about, you just for that book, the Treacherous Alliances book, part of the research that you did is that you traveled to both Iran and Israel and spoke to officials, maybe track 2 officials here and there. In Iran, it's hard because, those kind of think tanks in Iran are often linked to the government. People come in and out of government. Interestingly, Hezbollah in Lebanon has the same thing, where you'll have someone who's fighting one year on the front line and the next year they're working at a think tank. I think it's something kind of unique to the Islamic Republic institutions.
Exactly the same thing here in Washington.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah, they go in and out of government and think tanks.
In and out of government, exactly. Yeah. Another one of those things in which the Iranians are copying the U.S. despite all of their problems with the United States.
So you were in Iran and you have this sense that I think a lot of people don't understand. They think the Mullah regime, the Khamenei regime, and you get rid of the Khamenei and the whole thing falls apart. Give us a sense of the complexity of that. I don't think enough has been talked about, because this strategy for this war, in which we got to say, bachehab khub bazi kardan. The kids played well. They did a good war. I've heard even like my monarchist, anti-regime friends and associates acknowledge that, wow, they really impressed with their strategy. They really impressed the world in how they fended off 2 nuclear powers. Talk a little bit about what is the kind of origin of the thinking that came up with this kind of strategy for this kind of war.
Let me first start off, Borzo, and mention that I want to be the first one to acknowledge that my understanding of Iran absolutely is imperfect, because I've not been able to go back for roughly 20 or so years now. because of that book, because of the fact that I had spent a lot of time in Israel interviewing Israeli officials, and of course that I was very critical of the Iranian government, particularly during the 2009 protests, that really made it impossible for me to go back to Iran for a very long time. I still haven't been back since then. I've been told so by them that if I were to go back, I would face difficulties and most likely a prison sentence, because at the end of the day, if you travel to Israel, that gives you an automatic 5-year prison sentence. So I haven't been able to be back. I try to maintain as many contacts as possible with ordinary people, people who are in the think tank world over there, as well as officials. And I find that to be then an absolute necessity for me to be able to do my job. I am stunned by the number of people in Washington, I won't mention any names, that pass as experts on Iran. They also have not been in Iran for a very long time, but they don't talk to any officials. Some of them don't even speak Farsi or read Farsi. You would never have that with any other country. You cannot be an expert at a think tank in the United States on Brazil, never go to Brazil, not know any officials in Brazil, or be able to write or read articles in Portuguese. It's just not possible. On Iran, it's just a completely different reality. But I would also put myself in that camp. I've not been back for 20 years, so I have great challenges to be able to get that pulse. But if from the far that I have been able to study and the contacts I nevertheless maintain inside the country, which have gone up and down, has significantly grown just in the last couple of months because of the war, of course. But nevertheless, what you see is that the Iranians already in the Iraq-Iran war had to rely on their own innovations to be able to win that war, or at least make sure that it wasn't a complete loss. At the end of the day, it went on for 8 years. There's a massive amount of cost to the Iranians. They could have won it in 1982, but Khomeini, in my view, extremely unwisely decided to continue the war. And it's some of the worst things that happened in the war, particularly the use of chemical weapons, all came after 1982, or most of it came after 1982. But in that, they had to come up with their own doctrines and methods, etc. And many of them were very, very successful, despite the fact that they were at a huge disadvantage vis-a-vis the Iraqis in terms of technology support, intelligence support. After 1986, the Iranians could not launch a single surprise attack on the Iraqis because the United States was giving the Iraqis continuous intelligence support, showing all of the different movements of the Iranians, technology and intelligence that the Iraqis themselves could not have. Despite that, they could not be defeated. And we've seen how they have used a lot of that and developed it further in asymmetric warfare that they conducted in Iraq, in Afghanistan, of course, as in Syria as well. And I'm not passing any judgment. I'm just talking about exactly what happened. This is not an endorsement of it or critique of it. I'm just trying to explain what happened. Throughout all of this, it's also very important to remember, since the 1990s, after Saddam Hussein first was defeated, and certainly after the second defeat in which he was completely removed, the single organizing principle for Iran's military forces has been to defeat an American invasion of Iran from the south. So we're talking about how they have prepared for this for more than 20, 30. Since a little bit later than 91, but nevertheless, somewhere in the mid-1990s, the focus really shifted. And it was all about that would be the next big war. And
because everyone talks about 2003 as the starting point, but that is interesting. You're saying it actually started in the 90s.
It started earlier on than that. Of course, they were not ever taking their eyes off the ball of Iraq, but Iraq and Saddam was really boxed in. And that became clear after a couple of years after the Persian Gulf War in 1991. So there's been this massive preparation for it. The amount of rockets, missiles that they built and hid in mountains, the tunnel system, then later on combining it and integrating it with the use of drones and increasingly having very smart drones. You know, some of these drones are based, they took down American drones that were flying in Afghanistan, reverse engineered that and built drones that are now they're being exported to other countries. Of course, Russia is the main example of it. And so they've really invested in these different things and invested in the doctrine of how do you fight a much, much powerful enemy. And you weaponize geography to your favor. You weaponize asymmetric approaches to your favor because they're smart enough to understand that if they were fighting the United States like Saddam was having a massive military clashing with the American military, no one stands a chance against the United States. But if you fight it asymmetrically, then it's a completely different situation. And if you manage to weaponize geography in your favor in a manner that the Iranians now did beyond their own expectation when it came to the closing of the strait, then all bets are off. Now, I personally think that the Iranians surprised themselves, not just the US, not just Israel, not some of these, only the monarchies, although they're completely irrelevant at this point, but they surprised themselves. I do not think they thought this was going to go as successfully as it did. For instance, to give you an example, the Iranians expected the United States to blockade the Persian Gulf on day one. They did not expect that the United States would take 5-6 weeks before they took that step. So during those 5-6 weeks, and the time difference may be a little bit different, but nevertheless, during that period, the Iranians actually sold more oil than they did prior to the war at a higher price with almost no discount. You know, they had to give discounts because of the sanctions. And they made a tremendous amount of money during that period that they did not expect to happen at all. And that gave them another buffer to be able to keep this war going if need be much longer than their original expectation, because they thought the U.S. was going to close the blockade the Persian Gulf on day one, and it didn't.
Yeah. You know what's kind of interesting to look at right now is this. In terms of this memorandum of understanding, this piece that is coming up, the relationship between Israel and the United States that appears to be strained. Do you think that that is part of the Iranian strategy right now to press on those pressure points? For example, you know, one of the things that a country that is trying to undermine another country would do is to find the social divides in that country and press on them. So, for example, if you're a foreign country or organization and you want to destroy Great Britain, you would find the tensions between the Scots and the English people, the northern people and the southern people, and play on those and so on. And I think that the countries have very successfully done that in Lebanon and play on those differences and so on. Do you think that the Iranians are playing on domestic American tensions and political tensions? How closely are those think tanks and thinkers and strategists watching, for example, you know, what is happening with the upcoming midterm elections, the debate about Israel in the United States? Is that something that they are looking at and playing with?
Yes. And I think it's fair to say that the Iranian side has always better understood the United States than the American side has understood Iran. In the Rouhani government, almost all of the top ministers had a degree from an American university. You've never had anyone in any particular position in the US government that ever had a degree from an Iranian university. But what we have seen in the last year is stunning, and I don't know how to explain it. It's not just these AI videos that have an amazing sense of the pulse of American society. It started off earlier on. Look at how Araghchi was messaging a lot of things, the Iranian foreign minister, on social media, even before the war, even before the June war, playing on things, recognizing the divisions that existed, also recognizing the kind of messaging that would be effective with the MAGA crowd, pointing to, you know, the negative role Israel has played in their view in American foreign policy, pointing to the manner in which opening up the Iranian economy to American businesses as part of a deal would be very beneficial for the American middle class. Writing an op-ed in Washington Post, if I'm not mistaken, in which he talked about $1 trillion business opportunity for U.S. businesses. So it started already then, but then during the war, particularly with these Lego videos, it's just remarkable how effective they have been and how well they understood things that people in Washington don't understand. I'm in Washington. We're in touch with a lot of people. I mean, the common joke is that the Quincy Institute has very little support in Washington, but it has like 80% of the American people on its side when it comes to the approach to foreign policy that we are advocating. And the American foreign policy elite is just hopelessly out of touch with the American public. When the Clinton campaign lost and Jake Sullivan went into, I think he was at Carnegie, he was part of a study that was trying to figure out why is there such a disconnect between where the American public is and where the American foreign policy, including the democratic policy elite, was. And they did this big study and they kind of recognized how the American public, by and large, doesn't see the American foreign policy being beneficial to them. All of these wars have been disastrous, et cetera, et cetera. And this was a very critical part as to why he made his message saying that every decision the Biden administration is going to make on foreign policy, the test it's going to have to meet is it going to be good for the American middle class? So what you saw there was a recognition of the problem, but the solution that they put forward at the end of the day was to just change the language of American foreign policy, pretend that it was designed to help the American middle class. But in reality, nothing really changed. And that really became clear with the manner in which the Biden administration became full partners in a genocide. And they refused to listen to the American public, including their own base. So they've always been so out of touch with what the American people want. And then to see that the Iranians have figured it out, and not only figured it out, but they actually can express it and they can put it on these AI videos. I have no idea how they did it. It's going to be really fascinating to see if at some point someone writes a fantastic dissertation or article, whatever, and manages to really talk to the Iranian side and have someone then explain, how did they do it? Because people in Washington cannot do these videos.
Yeah. But I think it's even deeper than that. It's to some extent, like I'm kind of impressed, for example, with the Lebanon card, playing the Lebanon card, because it would take a very subtle and astute observer of Washington to understand that there is actually a constituency inside the elite, inside the Beltway, that is very kind of pro-Lebanon and has this romantic view of Lebanon and is sympathetic to Lebanon. And then you see that messaging coming out from Trump, where you don't see it about Gaza, but it would require a real understanding of that. Have you given your...
Although I don't think, that's a very interesting point, Borzo. Yeah. And I don't know, again, I'm honestly, I don't know if the Iranians really calculated that.
With Lebanon.
I think with Lebanon. I think the Iranians did this for a variety of reasons. And the most important reason is that they are in the process of, after having asserted their own deterrent, to extend that deterrence to Lebanon because they're rebuilding their forward defense. In 2006, the Israelis and Hezbollah went at each other in that war. I spoke to the Israeli deputy defense minister at the time, Efraim Sneh, and he told me that Lebanon is just a prelude. And I put this in one of my later books, that eventually the war will lead to Iran. It's inevitable, he said. But reality was that they needed to first defeat Hezbollah because that was Iran's first line of defense before they went at Iran itself. But because the Israelis never managed to defeat Hezbollah, in fact, Hezbollah defeated them in 2006, the war with Iran did not take place in 2006. It took place in 2024, 2025, and 2026, because by then Hezbollah had been dramatically weakened and the entire axis of Iran had been dramatically weakened. Iran's forward defense was no longer there. And now, having come out of this war successfully to a certain extent, the Iranians are trying to reestablish that forward defense. I think it was Arakchi or someone else who said recently, Iran's deterrence will never again be on Iran's own soil, that they will go back to a doctrine of forward defense and having their deterrence, their first line of defense, being elsewhere. Because ultimately, they will not trust this agreement with the United States. They will go for it, but they will not trust it. But they will trust their forward defense because it was successful for 20 years.
That was actually my next question. There does seem to be a lot of mistrust. And on Friday, today, there was basically a collapse of the Memorandum of Understanding. And there was talk of perhaps having a meeting later, no discussions getting underway and so on. How much mistrust is there? And is there any possibility in the mind of the Iranians that this is all a ruse? This whole J.D. Vance coming out and saying negative things about Israel, this clash between Netanyahu and Trump, this criticism of Israel, that it's all meant to once again lull the Iranians. Is that likely, in your opinion? And do the Iranians consider that likely in your...
Well, the Iranians consider it very likely. I don't think it is likely. I think that for understandable reasons, the Iranians are, of course, extremely suspicious of anything that comes out of the U.S. and Israel. They've seen, of course, the U.S. attacking them twice in the midst of negotiations. There was a significant concern before signing the MOU that this was just something Trump was doing to calm everything down before the midterms, but after the midterms, he would go back to war. I personally did not find that to be particularly likely. I think, again, because Iran has been burned so many times, there's a tendency to lean towards these kind of very skeptical analysis, but perhaps lean to it too much. If Trump actually had a successful military option, he would exercise it right now. He would have exercised it last month, and he would have gone into the midterms as a military victor, rather than to have to go through what he's doing right now, which both the left and the right is attacking him for this deal. So that would have been a much better political strategy if he had the military option. Reality is he doesn't, and that's why he's going for this. So I think the Iranians are, because of their experience, being over-paranoid. Some paranoia is absolutely warranted, but they're being over-paranoid. And when it comes to the U.S. and Israel right now, I think they're committing a huge mistake if they're dismissing this. This is not just a shift that is being laid. I think particularly what JD said yesterday, is the beginning of a potential paradigm shift of Israeli-US relations that I think is very deliberate and strongly desired on the restraint side of the Trump administration. It's not because they want to have an enmity with Israel or anything like that, but they're reasserting who actually is the superpower in this equation. And if Israel is acting against US Israel, they're not going to bend over or they're not going to roll over and play dead like previous presidents have done oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes. And that is something that they see as being necessary in order for the United States to extract itself from the region and not constantly be sucked back into wars that Israel support or have started.
For listeners and viewers, the reference to J.D. Vance is in reference to comments that he made, in case you didn't see them, in which he basically stated some facts. He said that Israel is a weak power that needed U.S. support, a lot of U.S. support to defend itself against Iran, and also that Israel is isolated and that it has no other friends in the world except the United States, and it should be careful. So it was an extraordinary moment, in case you missed it.
There was a previous data point that I think is also very important from Trump himself, in which he said that the Iranians are rational. He even said that they're pleasant to deal with, which I think very few people will be convinced by. And he also said that...
You ever had an Iranian accountant or lawyer or dentist? Anyway.
No, I'm just talking about the government, obviously.
I'm joking.
And that he also said something that they care about rebuilding their country or their people, something like that. And you can easily dismiss it as just, the off-the-cuff type of flattery that Trump occasionally does give countries. But I think this was actually very calculated, because he went directly at three pillars of the Israeli narrative that they had built up in Washington, D.C. for the last 20 plus years, which says that Iran is ideological, it is irrational, and it is suicidal. If you accept these three pillars, it means that the irrationality and ideological part eliminates both diplomacy and deterrence as a policy option. Because you cannot have deterrence against a country that is irrational and doesn't make rational decisions. Deterrence is really premised on rationality. And if you add to it that they're suicidal, they have a desire to kill themselves, then you cannot just wait for them to attack you. They will attack you, so you have no option but to go for preventive war. So this is a narrative that the Israelis themselves know is not true, but it is very useful to corner the United States into having no other option but an elective war with Iran. And it's been quite successful. A lot of people in Washington believe it. Until then, Trump suddenly goes out and he challenges all of them in just a couple of sentences. Iran is not, he says that they're rational, not irrational. They're pleasant to deal with, and they care about the state of their country, so they're not suicidal. I'm not saying that him saying it once is enough, but if you want to destroy these pillars and completely change the narrative in Washington, you have to take these on head on. And that's what he's doing. He's going to have to repeat it 100 times, and others are going to have to repeat it as well. And it's going to take some time to undo something that has been so deeply held by a lot of people in Washington. But I don't think for a second that that was a coincidence. I think that was a very calculated effort for him to really show the Israelis what he's willing to do if they mess with his deal.
Yeah. Do you think that it's in the Iranians' interest to stretch out this deal, to keep renewing these 2 months and dragging it on? That does seem to be the Iranian way in these negotiations often. And so they haven't, for whose advantage is it to keep the negotiations stretching out as long as possible? Iran or the US?
Only the Israelis will benefit from it. Neither the US nor Iran will benefit from it. I think the Iranians should pay attention to a couple of key factors here. One is that Trump's capacity to actually implement the sanctions relief. The Iranians rightfully are skeptical, not just about the sanctions getting lifted or really being put on the table, but actually that if they agree to lift them, that implementation will be solid. It wasn't under the Obama deal. There were a lot of challenges with the sanctions relief. It's partly very innocent. The United States doesn't have a lot of experience with lifting sanctions. Has a lot of experience of imposing sanctions, but it almost never lifts sanctions. And a lot of the banks were very skeptical. I mean, John Kerry did a tour meeting with all of these different banks, trying to convince them that it is okay now to deal with these transactions. Right. But the banks were very skeptical because they had never come across sanctions relief, really. Yeah. So the Iranians are skeptical about it, but they should understand, in my view, that Trump's capacity of implementing it is much stronger before the midterms, because after the midterms, he will transition into being increasingly a lame duck. And also the composition of Congress may change in such a manner that it will be more difficult for him to be able to fight these battles. So it really lies in the interest of the Iranians, in my view. I was actually disappointed to see that they decided this would be a 60-day negotiation rather than 30 days. I know 30 days is extremely cramped. But in order to make sure that this is done and implemented well, they should move fast. The same thing happened under the Obama administration, by the way. There were moments in which they could have gone for a deal. Both sides over-negotiated, took much longer. By the time the deal was done, the American side had such Iran fatigue, and they had neglected so many other priorities for such a long time that they just shifted their focus towards everything else that they had neglected, instead of really putting the right type of pressure on the implementation of the deal. So even before Trump walked out of the deal, it was a lot of problems. Had they concluded the JCPOA a year earlier, and Obama had one more year of implementation, it would have actually become much, much stronger. And it would be a huge mistake, both for the Iranians and the Americans, to repeat that mistake, in my view.
You speak to a lot of people, not just on television, but also at think tanks and conferences and so on. Have you ever consulted with this White House or people close to this White House and the State Department, right now, Mark Rubio's State Department?
I've been talking to the U.S. side, the Iranian side, throughout all of this.
That's why they wanted to deport you. That's why.
And of course, the Europeans,
they don't care about that.
Most,
they care. You were talking
they're
to
not
the
that
Americans.
important any longer.
No, but you were talking to the Americans. That's why they want to deport you.
I'm talking to the Americans. I'm talking to the Chinese. I'm talking to most of the GCC states. You know, it's very important to understand.
Give me a scoop here. Did you talk to J.D. Vance's people?
I cannot go into any of those details, but let me put it this way. What Quincy's trying to do is to change the paradigm of American foreign policy, make sure that we are much better at creating peace, that we do avoid these wars. To do so, you have to talk to everyone on every side. That's how you end up becoming helpful. That's how we can put forward proposals. And I can not go into any of those ideas, etc., in hope of helping advance various, the U.S. government's ability to be able to move forward with some of these things. And to do that, they're not going to take you seriously unless you talk to everyone as well. You have to talk to everyone to be able to really be knowing what is going on and make sure that you, as a resultant, can put forward good ideas.
Trita Parsi, I want to also just mention that you are regularly a guest on Breaking Points on the podcast and the YouTube channel with Crystal and Sagar, and you're really out there a lot, and you speak kind of regularly with those guys. I wanted to pitch that show. And I wanted to also just emphasize drop site news. There's a few news outlets out there that regularly get these incredible scoops and have these prescient reports about Iran, just for the simple reason that they actually just read Tasnim news agency or talk to some low-level Iranian official. Yeah, just talk to some mid-ranking Iranian official or academic and so on, and they get stuff.
It's journalism.
Yeah, but for some reason, I don't know, none of the news networks do that. But Trita is out there on Crystal and Sagar, and if you get a chance, you should watch or listen to that show.
Can I say something quickly on that? Because I think one of the things that gives me hope is to see the emergence of a lot of fantastic alternative media shows. And I'm delighted to see what you're doing, Borzu, as well. And just seeing that a lot of people are now tuning into that to get analysis, news, etc., that is not going through the kind of filter that you see in mainstream media. Breaking News is doing an amazing job. Zeteo, Drop Site. There's just so many. And many of them have different audiences. What is really fascinating, young people have completely stopped watching cable news. And they're not, and older people, studies have shown, essentially rely on 1 to 2 news sources. Young people on average in the United States rely on 3 to 5 sources. And that's actually much better. They're taking the information from different places, they're comparing it, but interestingly enough, they're not including much of the mainstream media in those sources.
Trita Parsi, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm Borzu Dergahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands, and you can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. You can also find me at Apple Podcasts. You can find me on Spotify. You can find me on YouTube.